At 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 28th of November, 1953, a man came through a closed window on the 10th floor of a New York hotel and fell to the street below. He was 43 years old. He had a wife and 3 children asleep in Maryland. He was a scientist, one of the government's own, and by the time his body reached the sidewalk, the people who needed to know already knew. In the room he had fallen from, another man picked up the telephone. He did not call for an ambulance first. He called a number in the suburbs, and a voice on the line said only, "Well, he's gone." The man in the room answered, "Well, that's too bad." Then he sat back down and waited for the police to arrive. The dead man's name was Frank Olson. The official story, the one his family would be told and would believe for the next 22 years, was simple. He had suffered a nervous breakdown, and in the middle of the night, he had jumped. Almost none of that was a lie, but almost all of it was hidden. Because 9 days before Frank Olson went through that window, his own government had slipped a powerful drug into his drink without telling him. And everything that happened afterward, it would spend the next 40 years trying to keep buried. This is the story of the scientist the CIA drugged and never had to answer for. To understand how a chemist's slip of a drug could end a man's life, you have to know who Frank Olson was and what he did for a living. Olson was a bacteriologist, a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, a quiet manner, and a job most of his neighbors knew nothing about. He worked at Camp Detrick in Maryland, the center of America's biological weapons program. And within that secret world, he worked in its most secret corner, a unit called the Special Operations Division, where the science of disease was turned into a weapon of war. His specialty was aerosols, how to take a lethal germ and turn it into a fine mist that could be sprayed, released, carried on the wind. It was grim work, and the Cold War made it feel urgent. The men who did it were certain the Soviet Union was racing to do the same, and that whoever fell behind would lose everything. Olson was good at it. He rose to become the acting head of his division. But by the autumn of 1953, something in him had shifted. The people closest to him would later describe a man grown troubled, quieter than usual, uneasy, turning something over in his mind he could not set down. What exactly was weighing on him, we cannot say for certain. The record shows a man in distress, not a signed confession. But this much is clear. Frank Olson was beginning to want out, and in the world he worked in, wanting out was not a small thing. It was a problem. While Frank Olson was building weapons out of germs, another part of the government was trying to build a weapon out of the human mind. Its name was MKUltra. In 1953, the director of the CIA approved a program with a simple, chilling goal: to learn how to control the way people think. The agency had convinced itself that the Soviets and the Chinese had cracked the secret of brainwashing, that they could break a man's will and rewrite it, and that America was dangerously behind. So it went hunting for a key to the mind, and it was willing to try almost anything to find one. The program was run out of the CIA's technical services staff by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Under him, MKUltra branched into more than 150 secret projects spread across dozens of universities, hospitals, and prisons. It experimented with hypnosis, with electric shock, with total isolation. But the tool it kept returning to was a drug that had only recently arrived from a laboratory in Switzerland, LSD. The CIA wanted to know exactly what LSD did to a person, whether it could loosen a spy's tongue or take an enemy's mind apart. And to find out, it did something that today is almost impossible to believe. It gave the drug to people without telling them: patients, prisoners, ordinary citizens picked off the street. The reasoning was cold and simple. You could only see the drug's true effect on someone who had no idea they had taken it. No warning, no defenses, no explanation for why the world had suddenly come apart. To the men running MKUltra, that made unsuspecting people the perfect test subjects. In November of 1953, Frank Olson became one of them. It happened at a lake. In the middle of November 1953, a group of men from Camp Dietrich and the CIA gathered for a 3-day retreat at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake in the mountains of western Maryland. Part work, part unwinding, a rare chance for the two secret worlds, the germ men and the mind control men, to sit at the same table. On the second evening, Sidney Gottlieb produced a bottle of Cointreau and offered it around. Several of the men drank, Frank Olson among them. What none of them knew was that Gottlieb had laced the bottle with LSD. About 20 minutes later, after the drug was already in their blood, Gottlieb told them what they had just taken. Some of the men were furious. Olson went quiet. Over the hours that followed, the drug did what LSD does to a mind with no idea it is coming. For most of the group, it faded by morning into one strange, ugly night. For Frank Olson, it did not fade. He went home to his wife, Alice, a changed man, withdrawn, barely eating, sunk into a darkness she had never seen in him. At one point, he turned to her and said simply, "I've made a terrible mistake." He would not say what the mistake was. Whether he meant the work or the drug or something he had seen, no one can now be sure. By that Monday, he was so agitated that he walked into his supervisor's office and tried to resign. But the men around him did not send Frank Olson home to recover. They decided he needed treatment, and they knew exactly where to take him. To New York, to a doctor who worked for the CIA. The doctor's name was Harold Abramson. On paper, he was an allergist, a specialist in asthma and hay fever with no training in psychiatry at all. But Abramson had a second line of work. He had ties to the CIA, and he was one of the doctors the agency quietly used for its own research into LSD. When Frank Olson needed help, the men from MKUltra did not send him to an independent psychiatrist. They sent him to one of their own. Over the days that followed, Olson and his handlers shuttled back and forth between Washington and New York. He saw Abramson more than once. There was talk of rest, of a hospital. Olson swung between wanting to go home to his family and feeling too far gone, too ashamed to face them. Again and again he said the same thing, that he wanted to leave his job, to be let out of the secret world for good. On the night of the 27th of November, Frank Olson checked into the Statler Hotel across from Penn Station and took a room on the 10th floor with a CIA man named Robert Lashbrook, room 1018A. The last people to speak with him said he seemed calmer that evening, that he had talked about going home the next day in time for the weekend. Sometime after 2 in the morning, he went through the window. Lashbrook told police he had been asleep and woke to the sound of breaking glass. By the time anyone reached the street, Frank Olson was dead. His wife was told there had been an accident, or a suicide, that her husband, in the grip of a breakdown, had thrown himself from a high hotel window in the dark. That was the story, and it would stand unquestioned for 22 years. For the Olson family, the years that came next were quiet and gray. Alice Olson raised 3 children alone, under the weight of a death she had been told was her husband's own doing. She did not know about the lake. She did not know about the drink. She did not know that the letters CIA belonged anywhere near her husband's name. And the men who did know made sure it stayed that way. Inside the agency, there was an internal review. Gottlieb was mildly reprimanded, on paper, for a lapse in judgment. No one was charged. No one was fired. The experiment that had set an unwitting man on a fatal path was quietly filed as a tragic accident, and the program that produced it kept running for another 20 years. Then, in 1973, as scandal closed in on the CIA from every direction, its director, Richard Helms, gave an order. The MKUltra files, the record of 2 decades of drugging, shocking, and breaking human beings, were to be destroyed. Boxes of documents were pulled and shredded and burned. The paper trail that could have explained what was really done to people like Frank Olson was, on purpose, turned into ash. They very nearly closed it for good. By every intention, the story of Frank Olson should have ended right there. A shut case, a grieving family, a shredded file, a secret sealed forever. But a secret this large leaves fingerprints in places no one thinks to burn. And 2 years after the files went into the fire, one of those fingerprints surfaced, in a government report that was never supposed to mention Frank Olson at all. In 1975, in the long hangover of Watergate, Washington finally turned to look at its own intelligence agencies. Commissions were formed. Buried programs were dragged into daylight. And in one report on the abuses of the CIA, there sat a short, almost bureaucratic passage. An unnamed Army scientist had been given LSD without his knowledge in 1953 and had later fallen to his death from a New York hotel window. The Olson family read it in the newspaper. Alice and her children realized all at once that the anonymous scientist in the government's own report was their husband and father, and that the story they had carried for 22 years was a shell built over something else. What happened next was extraordinary. The family went public. The government, cornered, admitted the core of it. Frank Olson had been dosed with LSD by the CIA without his consent 9 days before he died. President Gerald Ford invited the Olsons to the White House and apologized to them in person. The director of the CIA apologized as well and handed the family a file of documents about Frank's final days. In 1976, Congress voted them a settlement of $750,000, and Ford signed a statement conceding that the LSD would appear to have been approximate cause of Frank Olson's death. By the standard of a government admitting fault, it was a remarkable reckoning. The apology was real. The money was real. But the documents the family had been handed described a suicide, a broken man who jumped. And the more Frank Olson's son Eric read them, the less they looked like an answer, and the more they looked like a better written version of the same cover story. So Eric Olson decided, whatever it cost him, to find out how his father had really died. For nearly 20 years, Eric Olson gathered everything he could find about the night his father died. And in 1994, more than 4 decades after Frank Olson was buried, his son had the body taken back out of the ground. He brought in a team led by James Starrs, a forensic scientist from George Washington University, to examine remains the 1953 investigation had barely looked at. What they found reopened everything. On the left side of Frank Olson's skull, Starrs' team found signs of a blow, a heavy head injury that, in their judgment, did not fit a fall through a window. And there were none of the deep cuts to the face and body you would expect from a man who had crashed through a sheet of glass. To Starrs, the forensic picture was, in his own words, rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. Suggestive that Frank Olson had been struck in that room and then put out the window already unconscious. It matters to be careful here. Starrs found strong suspicion, not proof. Even he admitted the head injury was a puzzle that science alone could not fully solve, and not everyone on his own team agreed. On the strength of the exhumation, the Manhattan District Attorney reopened the case as a possible murder, but after investigating, prosecutors decided they did not have enough to charge anyone. No one has ever stood trial for the death of Frank Olson. Officially, to this day, the case is unresolved. So we are left with 2 stories, and a gap between them that has never closed. In the first, a troubled man, his mind wrecked by a drug he never agreed to take, throws himself from a hotel window. In the second, a scientist who wanted out, who knew too much, is silenced by the people he worked for. The government admitted to the first. It has never had to answer for the second. What is beyond dispute is the part no one denies. Frank Olson's own country slipped a drug into his glass without his knowledge, watched him come apart, and then, when he was dead, spent 22 years making sure his widow and his children never learned why. Whatever truly happened in room 1018A, that much was done on purpose, and the file that might have told us the rest was fed, deliberately, into a fire. This is Buried Records, where the things people tried to erase get dug back up. If Frank Olson's story was new to you, subscribe and help us keep the buried records from staying buried. I'll see you in the next one.